Welcome to the Case for Funding the Arts and Resetting the Creative Economy. I'm Erica Mallon, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Arts Program. Many advocacy groups are making the case for big and new solutions to support the recovery and long-term sustainability of this critical industry that, like many, have been devastated by COVID-19. We've put together a panel of practitioners from different perspectives who are major industry leaders, innovators, and advocates to further this discussion, including the most recent news that movie theaters and other venues may be opening shortly. I'm pleased to welcome first Jason Farago. He is the art critic at large for the New York Times and a regular contributor to The Guardian, The New Yorker, and Art Forum. He recently authored the New York Times feature, Can the Arts Bring Us Back?, on how federal government support is critical to recovery. Nataki Garrett is an acclaimed director who has worked in theaters across the country and was named artistic director of the renowned Oregon Shakespeare Festival in 2019. He is currently mobilizing theater organizations across the nation on the industry's recovery. Jeremy O'Harris is playwright, screenwriter, and producer for film and television. His open letter to President Biden and Vice President Harris helps spur the campaign Be an Arts Hero, a grassroots effort calling on the Senate to allocate long-term relief to the arts and culture sector. And Kate Levin leads Bloomberg's Cultural Assets Management team and oversees Bloomberg Philanthropy's arts program, which is also providing major COVID relief funding. Previously, Kate was commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And our moderator, of course, is Anna Deavere Smith, incredible actress, groundbreaking playwright, author, and professor at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts and Aspen Institute trustee. Before I turn it over to Anna, I want to give some context to launch the conversation. According to the Federal Bureau of Economic Analysis, the arts and cultural economy is bigger than transportation or agriculture. It contributes $878 billion to our national economy and employs over 5 million people. Arts and culture also contribute at least $1 billion in revenue in each of the 50 states and is one of our biggest and most influential exports. Beyond the numbers, it's the fact that the arts has the unique power to educate, inspire, and foster empathy that is essential to society and our democracy that can lead us to meaningful social change. So with that context, and more to come, I give my thanks to all the participants, and I will now turn it over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Erica, very much, and thank you, Kitty Kuhn and the Aspen Institute. Thank you, Kitty, for putting us on the agenda. I expected nothing less of you. Jason, we have a half an hour, and all of you are quite verbal on this panel, and so we have a half an hour, and let's just jump right in. And of course, Jason, your article, Can the Arts Bring Us Back?, was so important. Let's start with some of the ideas you put forth there and what you're thinking since you wrote the article, given the fact that I'm sure you got a lot of response to it.
I did. Thanks very much for this, and thanks to all of you for watching. The question of arts funding, I think it's important to break down into short-term and long-term. And the article that I wrote was very specifically about short-term questions for the economics of culture. As we were just hearing, beyond culture's value in and of itself, culture is an industry sector of no small size, 4.5% of GDP. And here in New York, in the state of New York, that is, I believe it's something like 7 or 8% of GDP. Though I am, of course, always wary of reducing the value of culture to anything on a bottom line, we are talking about massive, massive numbers. And in unemployment terms, massive numbers as well. More than half of actors and dancers were out of work in 2020 when the unemployment rate in general was around 8 or 9%. So we are talking not just large deficits, but very precipitous falls, and ones that therefore require quite precipitous reactions. What I wanted to really insist upon was the economic as opposed to the cultural approach that the new Biden administration might possibly take. First, by really insisting on unemployment insurance and other forms of unemployment relief possibly including new approaches to the tax code that could very possibly make lives better for artists immediately in the short term. And when I say artists, I don't even just mean visual artists, actors, dancers. I also mean technicians, stage managers, all the people in the cultural sector that keep our culture vibrant and alive. Beyond that is the question of whether there is a role for direct federal employment for artists and other cultural practitioners on the model of the WPA in the 1930s or CETA in the 1970s, whether there is an important role that the federal government can play in quite direct spending. I believe there is, though, again, it would be something that would be less culturally targeted and more understood as emergency funding, as an emergency activity. And I'd love to talk to our other panelists about that, too. And then finally, I was interested in the question of whether a Department of Culture or a White House Office of Culture could possibly organize or synchronize the government's response to the possible cultural depression that we're facing. I think that people can have legitimate differences about the right way for the federal government to engage with culture, but something larger and something more direct is clearly necessary.
So, Jeremy, of course, your very exhaustive and wonderful letter to Biden and Harris, and you've been on the front lines with Be an Arts Hero and lots of other ways that you've been incredibly generous to the arts community. Take it away from what Jason has said, and let's hear some of your ideas.
Yeah, I mean, and again, thank you all for having me. I still feel very odd being in sort of like the company of idols and wildly intelligent, like people who do a lot of different things. But for me, it all came from the sense that what's happening to my peers and many other people is incredibly dire. And people aren't thinking about the fact that, you know, the loss of a season or 2 seasons of theater is the like beginning and end of an artistic career for many people at the very beginning of it, and a lot of people in the nascence of their career. Because this year and a half of no work, no money, and no options is going to be, it's been a year where people have had to figure out, like, do they stay in these cultural centers in New York or LA or Chicago? Can they afford to pay their food expenses and their light expenses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so for me, thinking about moments when America was in a major economic crisis and how they got out of it, I started to think a lot about the New Deal and the WPA and Federal One, and how Federal One in its creation was created not just to get people working in art sectors in America, but to get people all around America working from arts. Like the goal of the Federal Theater Project was to make sure that there was theater happening in all 50 states, which is like a wildly inclusive and like incredibly necessary act, because what FDR and a lot of his cohorts saw was that art wasn't just something for the soul, which I think is sort of the thing that a lot of artists lean on when they try to advocate to the public. And the soul is intangible; no one cares about it. But what art also is our greatest export. It's our one of our best tools of like explaining to the world like America's freedom, right? And I'm not here like banging the drum of imperialism as like a good thing, but I'm speaking the language of politics and saying, if you want to be able to keep shaping the culture in the way we have, and you want there to be a generation that can do that later, then like the people that can do that need to be fed and need to be paid to build this work and have some financial foundations for how they're going to continue making this work for the next 5 to 10 years. Because the arts, the people who run arts organizations are freaking out right now because they don't have any money from their from the federal government, and they also are losing the money from the philanthropists who have funded most of the arts organizations in America for the last 60, 70 years. And I think Nataki could probably speak more to that, but I feel like it must be a really hard time to be a nonprofit in this moment because pockets are tighter everywhere. And so I think this is like becoming an even more pressing issue for the new Biden administration to start thinking about the ways to like bail out, if you will, arts workers across America.
Great. And Nataki, on 2 counts, yes, also 50 states, you're way out there in Oregon. So for you, this is not, a New York City thing at all. And you are, as Jeremy has suggested, running an arts organization. Are you freaking out? Can't hear you. Can't hear Nataki. Are you? You're muted.
Is that better?
That's much better.
Okay.
I was asking if you're freaking out.
I was freaking out. I don't know if I'm freaking out as much as I was at the height of this last year. This time last year was, we opened 5 shows, we closed them in 6 days, we laid off 500 people. And then we got about the business, as we started talking to our 1% donors right away. They were involved in all kinds of activities, including this was an election year. So just like Jeremy said, there was a waning of resources. Not that they didn't give, they just didn't give in the way that we needed them to in order to pull us through this time. And so I worked with a group of arts organizations here in Oregon, and we were able to procure $8 million of the CARES Act fund. The reason why I'm saying that is because that led me to push towards building a coalition. And so I'm working with about 40 theaters from across the United States and the law firm Arnold and Porter, and we represent every region of the country, urban and rural, large and small, predominantly white theaters and culturally specific theaters. We sort of run as much of the gamut as we possibly can. And we actually lobbied to make sure that the nonprofit theaters were included in the recent Save Our Stages bill, which became the SBOG. And so we hope that at the end of all of the comb out that they're doing legislatively, that we will still have access to that tranche of money. But my thing was the only way we can get the arts workers working is if the theaters remain. And so, I'm at the beginning of my leadership here at OSF. It was important for me to make sure that we could pull through to the other side. It's interesting because we actually asked during the entire lobbying period, trying to make sure that the nonprofit theaters were included in SVOG, if we could be a resource, if we could actually procure some money to be able to give emergency funding to some of our artists. I have a company theater. So we have actors and we have technicians and we have artisans and we have crews, and we're working with all the unions, and everybody is out of work. Like I said, 500 people. We asked, and we were told there's no way that the federal government was going to float the money through us unless we could hire people back. So we're just waiting for the go ahead to see when we can start to hire people back, and as soon as we can, we will. In the meantime, we started to put money into people's pockets in as many other ways as we possibly can, because like Jeremy said, and like Jason said, we're about to lose a generation in these 2 years of this pandemic seems like it's going to last all the way through this year. We're going to lose a generation of artists who would launch their careers into these first couple of years, begin their early days in this work and be able to establish themselves so that in 5 years, they're more established and better capable of taking advantage of opportunities. So we have to build the whole industry back. Holding on, having this little tranche of money is great for artistic organizations, but it's only going to last us for a little bit. We actually have to get the whole thing back rolling again.
Kate, you are a philanthropist. You work in government as the New York City Cultural Affairs Commissioner, and I also know that you have some sense of history. Do you feel it's too optimistic to think that we might be able to build something like the Federal Theater? And why are we in the position of nonprofit and for-profit anyway? In other words, many of the assumptions we make are things that didn't already exist. So what do you think, just looking at history, about what we might do, what we're not thinking about?
I think the history here is really germane. It doesn't for a minute set aside the urgency people are feeling, this sense that Nataki and Jeremy and Jason have conveyed about what's really at stake. But let me start by saying, and I've been advocating for this field for a long time. My hair wasn't gray when I started, and coming out of 2008, a congressman read into the congressional record that arts were not going to be included except for aquariums and golf courses because this wasn't real work. So, credit to all of you for, in a relatively short period of time, really starting to change the advocacy game. and make this whole sector get taken seriously at the federal government level. Government isn't the only indicator of the importance of this sector, but it's certainly an important bellwether. And I think the historical context here, really in the US, the division of nonprofit, the creation of the nonprofit sector, there were some pre-World War II, but it really took off after that. And and the real explosion in the theater industry, for example, was with the Ford Foundation in 1961, seeding the regional theater company movement. But there were something like 23 regional theaters in 1960. Now there are, or were, over 2,000. It's an extraordinary rate of growth. The same thing with museums. I think half of the museums in the US were created since 1970. There's some statistic I read that a new museum was being created once every 3 days in the early 1960s. So, the great news in all that is that the sector has risen to meet the need. The awful, unpleasant news is that we tend to think that yesterday is the way things always were. Not so much the case here. And so, the conversation on the spectrum of the creative sector, from amateur to professional and from nonprofit to commercial, in some ways this is a real reckoning. And the question is, how do you come out the other side with the most vibrant group of artists and the ability to meet audiences? And the position of organizations is really, how do you mediate that relationship? I think a lot of the attention gets focused on organizations, as it should, but almost as a self-perpetuating kind of momentum. And sometimes, in the past at least, the question of supporting artists has gotten dropped out. That was certainly the case of the culture wars in the 1990s. So bringing that back and bringing this all back as a sector where real people do real work is so urgent.
Right. Well, yeah, but you and I both know that foundations are not very excited about supporting individual artists. And speaking of organizations, I can't possibly sit here in good conscience and hear words like soul and hear words like empathy and not think about the fact that after the murder of George Floyd was a time that many artists and arts organizations had to think about just how healthy our organizations are and are not. And are we really the ones who can walk around talking about helping America's soul and being empathic? Nataki, could you respond?
Yeah, so Oregon Shakespeare Festival has been focused on the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion before I got here in 2019. So it's been invested in this work for like 8 or 9 years, and it led the charge across the field. That said, when I looked at the We See You White American Theater demands list that came out last summer, I couldn't help but wonder how many of those demands came out of experiences people had within our kinds of theaters. People like to say that when I talk to some of my colleagues in the field, that the George Floyd murder and the protest that ensued and the uprising that ensued with Black Lives Matter right after, that's for them a kind of turning point. For me, I feel like turning point happened, when I the first time I entered a white theater space and realized that I was the other. And so for me, it's a mandate to make sure that when we do bring our theaters back, that we bring them back with this idea of not just being equitable, and it's not only about being anti-racist, it's about creating spaces where the artists are not harmed. And there have been several articles that that our writers have written and that our actors have said, and there were a bunch of exposés on Facebook last year where people said that they had these terrible experiences, and we cannot create a space in which that can happen. And we can bring back our theaters, yes, sure, but we also have to bring them back into relevancy, and that requires that we do this real work. And so OSF, for example, after all of those years of doing this work in equity and diversity and inclusion, we've decided to take on the demands list from the We See White American Theater as a document to help lead us to what is the 21st century version of how do we shift this. Because those demands were created by artists like Jeremy, like myself, like you, Anna Deavere Smith, those are the demands that represent experiences, real experiences that we've had in the theater, and we have to shift. And if you're not shifting your theater, it won't be relevant for the rest of the 21st century. So the industries have to shift. The arts have to shift. We have participated in white supremacy in some of the most egregious ways, including the way we bring people into our spaces. By saying that these are the most important pieces of art. These playwrights, we center men, we center cisgendered white men, we center cisgendered Black and brown men, and we do not take on the stories that allow for people to live in their full dynamic expression. And then we ask those people to come into the room, and we go, well, how come you don't want to come back? Because nothing in this room has invited me. So we have to shift across the board. And actually, the theater actually has an opportunity to lead this idea of becoming a more just and equitable anti-racist society in which the artists are not harmed. But we actually have to step into the gap in order to do that.
What are some of the other things as we're in this emergency moment, and triage? Emergencies do bring new ways of doing things. What are some of the other things we need to think about when we so-called come back? And I'm, also just thinking about what Kate, was pointing out. It's like all of a sudden, there's 2,000 arts institutions and more compared to 200 or whatever. So we can't possibly say America doesn't like art, right? We like to say that stuff, or we are of value to this country. I see you shaking your head, Jeremy.
Yeah,
things we need to fix. Other things we need to fix coming back.
There are a litany of things, and I just want to say I didn't sign the We See You American Theater letter because I felt like it was so invested in institutions that are already fraught and already broken, right? It's like master's house, master's tools, yada, yada, yada. So I was like, I have no interest in this. I think we need to invest in literally creating entirely new spaces. And I pulled this book out because it's really important to me. It's called Radical Black Theater and the New Deal. And one of the things that really touched me that Kate just said was that it was the question of how do we have the most vibrant group of artists supported when we come back. And I don't think that'll happen if we give the money to institutions, because the most vibrant groups of artists generally aren't represented by those theaters. I don't know that we can trust theaters that have just now discovered that racism existed at the end of 2020, to find Black and brown people to put at the center of these things. I don't know if I want to trust theaters that just remembered that women are under the foot of patriarchy during the Me Too movement in 2017 to be in charge of this leadership. And one of the things that people don't remember about the Federal Run and the Federal Writers Project and the Federal Theater Project is that because it was so democratized and socialized and anyone could get the money, you had people doing radical work, making the first culturally specific theater companies, the first gender specific theater companies, because they were able to get this money from the government and do whatever the hell they wanted to do with it. There was no artistic director to tell them how to work on it, no board that said we will or won't produce this. They got to do radical work in the ways they wanted to do it, and it actually jump-started the sense that identitarian work in affinity theater companies were possible and were necessary to making these radical things. I think also, too, that in this moment, one of the things that's been so frustrating about watching how institutions have responded to it, outside of their silence, is their inability to imagine that this moment could be a moment for radical transformation of our industry. This, for the first time ever, we were all forced to be in a space that many of our theater friends who are theater lovers and partners and comrades who are theater makers have had to deal with. Because I know many disabled and immunocompromised theater artists who can't just casually go to a theater on a Tuesday night for whatever reason. And this, for me, felt felt like a moment to invest in new processes and new practices of radically inviting new audiences to spaces that they have never been felt invited to before. And I felt like I saw a lot of people dropping the ball in that way. So I decided to take a lot of the money I had gotten from my HBO deal to start investing in the work of theater artists who I thought were thinking outside of the box of like the four walls of a theater that was created by some white man in the 1960s, and saying like, hey, how can I get this to a bunch of queer Black and brown kids all over the country, all over the world, over a week online? And I think we did that. We made this show called Circle Jerk that went like incredibly viral. I've been supporting this young trans theater maker named Sis and her exploration of what it means to be a Black trans woman through this digital theater show she did that premiered on YouTube. And I financed Will Arbery's Heroes of the Fourth Turning right before the election. And each of those shows have had over 50,000 people watch them. And they were all presented for essentially free or on sliding scales and have made back over $300,000. Like, and these are 3 independent theater adventures that just like were me exploring with my own money and the ingenuity of young artists. And the fact that the public theater, like, MTC, CTG were not the people at the front line of doing this work is shocking to me.
Well,
and it makes
they're not going to be at the front line of doing the work, Jeremy, but for the very reason that you just said. And Kate indicates this too. It's individuals who are nimble and opportunistic. Kate, those are words I've heard you use, and I'm stealing them. I love those words. Who can do something. Institutions cannot move that quickly. You're a philanthropist, but you're also generous of heart and not only thinking about your own career. You know that your own career can only really thrive in a healthier environment. Jason, back to the economy. What do you think is really realistic for us to focus on?
What's realistic? I think that in the spring and the early summer of 2020, it was not even remotely realistic to imagine that Mitch McConnell's Senate would authorize the largest government stimulus package that, at least in absolute terms, not relative terms, that this country's ever seen. And the idea that $600 a week of supplemental unemployment insurance was dispersed under the previous government was not something I necessarily thought was ever possible. And in particular, what I think was extremely important, and I think what needs to be really reinforced right now, is that $600 a week of supplemental unemployment insurance was not just for people who got W-2 money, it was for people who got 1099 money, people who were self-employed or otherwise in the gig economy, which includes most of our artists are musicians and other people working in the cultural sector. It's called Pandemic Unemployment Insurance, and it's one of the most extraordinary achievements of the CARES Act. I think that what Janet Yellen and also Marty Walsh at Labor should really be thinking about is how we can possibly alleviate the tax burden and the disadvantages that come with being self-employed or that come with being a gig worker that artists take on, especially early in their career, in order to develop their career in such a way that they can actually make enough money in order to put food on the table. What kind of programs, at least in economic terms, as opposed to in cultural terms, can we really imagine? One I think that is extremely important is the idea of recognizing that people who work in the arts are workers and not just artists, and need to be insured as such, taxed as such, and given retirement benefits, maternity leave, all sorts of things like this. There are models in Europe and Australia that can be profitably looked at here. And then one final thing I would really want to say, Kate was mentioning earlier, the example of the culture wars of the 1980s and early 1990s. I think it's pretty clear that the idea of individual funding for artists at the kind of NEA level is not coming back anytime soon essentially because of the sort of high risk and low reward, in which, like, for a very small amount of funding, you risk massive governmental scandal. What is possible, and I think it's something that Jeremy was raising earlier, is what made the programs of the 1930s so successful? It was precisely because there were no strings attached economic stimulus packages, as opposed to a more European-style cultural funding that gave the vibrancy and the diversity of programming. And it's worth pointing out, I said this in the piece I wrote for the Times, a lot of things that were done under Federal Project Number 1 were not masterpieces. But that was not the goal. It was a works product. And if some of them were enduring, and if others of them have been forgotten, that is not actually the principal means by which we should assess the importance of these programs. It is about giving artists, and in particular, I would know, Black artists in the 1930s, there had never been, until the end of the 20th century, any level of federal funding for Black artists, and also writers, I should point out, that even comes close to approximating what Federal Project Number 1 did. But what was so important is that they said to them, you know what? You can't have a woman with her bare breasts out, and you can't have a hammer and sickle on it. But other than that, take the money. And that really, really is, I think, what has to be understood. And it's especially why I think that thinking in short term, thinking as stimulus as opposed to as cultural packages, is precisely the way the Biden administration should be done.
Thank you. And they're telling me I have to shut down. So it just means to me, Erica Mallon, that we need to have think tank environments so that wonderful people like Jeremy and Kate and Jason and Nataki can, we have models for that at the Aspen Institute, not just public events, but we need to bring folks together. And I just want to thank Erica again and Kitty Boone. And back to something you mentioned, Kate, when I asked you to take a historical perspective, the Aspen Institute, although started with a great love of art, lost its way. And it wasn't until the wisdom and the philanthropy of the late Sidney Harmon, yes, Harmon, and Michael Eisner that it put art back into its enterprise. It lost that for a while. So I think the Aspen Institute itself is a way that we can look at how we reinvigorate spaces with the arts. I'll give you the last word, Erica.
Absolutely. The Institute is the place for these kind of panels. We can take this 30,000-foot view and support the new ideas, support artists and organizations, and keep the conversation going that leads to action. And this is a perfect example of, what's next, of people coming together. Everyone's chatting amongst each other. And I certainly think there's part 2 and part 3, part 4 of this conversation. And I'm thrilled, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Anna, for your always fabulous moderating, and so much more to come. Thank you all.